The Velthrani Collective had ruled the Orion Spur for 300 years, and they had done it without firing many shots at all, because they preferred to work in shadows and whispers rather than open warfare. High strategist Kelvoth stood in his private chamber aboard the command station orbiting Velthros Prime, and he watched the holographic display that showed his crumbling empire with growing concern in his four pale eyes. The Reth had finally united against Velthrani influence, and their warships now patrolled borders that had once been open to Velthrani traders and spies. The Maokai were burning Velthrani outposts in the outer colonies and refusing all diplomatic contact. Even the docile Fenari were beginning to question the trade agreements that had kept them in economic chains for generations. Kelvoth's long fingers traced the boundaries of contested space, and he felt something he had not experienced in decades, which was genuine fear for the future of his people. "We need a solution," he said to the empty room, and his voice echoed off the polished walls that displayed the history of Velthrani conquest in beautiful murals. The door behind him opened, and his advisor, Melith, entered with her tablet clutched against her chest, and her expression was troubled. "High strategist," she said with a bow of her slender neck. "The Council awaits your presence, and they are demanding answers about the Reth situation." Kelvoth turned from the display and walked past her without acknowledgement, because he was already forming a plan in his mind, and it was a plan so clever and so cruel that it made him smile for the first time in months. The council chamber was filled with the most powerful members of Velthrani society, and they all fell silent when Kelvoth entered, because, despite the Empire's troubles, he remained the most feared individual in known space. Fellow architects of civilization. Kelvoth began as he took his place at the head of the great table. "I understand your concerns, and I share them because our position grows weaker by the day." Elder Sorveth raised one trembling hand and spoke with the authority of his 2 centuries of life. "The Reth Alliance threatens our trade routes and the Maokai. Rebellion drains our military resources, and we cannot fight on multiple fronts without allies of our own." Kelvoth nodded slowly and let the silence stretch, because he knew how to command a room and make everyone lean forward in anticipation. "What if I told you," he said at last, "that I have found a way to eliminate the Reth threat, and the solution requires almost none of our own resources?" The council members exchanged confused glances, and Melith looked up from her tablet with curiosity written across. A delicate feature as Kelvoth activated the central display, and an image appeared showing a blue and green planet that none of them recognized at first. "Earth," Kelvoth announced, and he watched the recognition dawn on their faces one by one. "The humans," Elder Sorveth whispered, and his voice carried a mixture of fascination and disgust. "Humanity had entered the galactic stage only 50 years ago, and they had spread across 100 colonies with a speed that unsettled every established species. They came from a world that other species could barely comprehend, because Earth was a nightmare of extreme conditions. The gravity was crushing compared to most inhabited worlds, and the atmosphere contained an oxidizing gas that would burn the lungs of most aliens. Predators roamed every continent, and deadly microorganisms filled every drop of water, and somehow humans had not only survived there, but had thrived and conquered their entire planet before reaching for the stars. The galactic community called them Deathworlders, and the term was not meant as a compliment, but what truly disturbed the Velthrani was not human strength or human endurance, but rather human behavior. They answered distress calls, Kelvoth said, and his smile grew wider as he continued. Every single time, without exception, and without asking what species sent the call, or whether there might be danger waiting for them. Councilor Vireth leaned forward with interest sparking in her eyes. "You mean to use this against them somehow?" "I mean to use it against everyone," Kelvoth replied, and he changed the display to show the border between human space and Reth territory. "We fabricate a distress signal and make it appear to come from a disabled colony transport carrying children because nothing motivates humans quite like endangered young ones. He traced a line on the map that showed a course directly into Wrath patrol zones. The humans will respond immediately and aggressively, and they will enter Wrath space without warning or diplomatic preparation. Elder Sorvith began to understand, and his eyes widened with something like admiration. The Wrath will see it as an invasion. Exactly. Kelvoth confirmed with satisfaction, and the Wrath will respond with force because they are a proud and territorial species, and they will fire upon the human ships. Melith looked uncomfortable as she spoke carefully because questioning the high strategist was dangerous. But the humans will surely explain themselves and offer peaceful resolution. Kelvoth laughed, and the sound was cold and sharp in the elegant chamber. The Wrath shoot first and investigate later, and by the time anyone understands what has happened, there will be dead on both sides, and neither species will trust the others. Explanations. He spread his hands wide as if presenting a gift to the council. They will go to war with each other, and we will watch from safety as our two greatest threats tear each other apart, and then we sweep in to claim whatever remains. The council was silent for a long moment, and then Elder Sorvith began to applaud with his thin hands making soft sounds in the quiet room. Brilliant, he declared. Absolutely brilliant, because we risk nothing and gain everything. Counselor? Virith nodded her agreement, and soon the entire council was voicing support for the plan that would change the galaxy forever. None of them considered that they might be wrong about humans. None of them imagined that the Deathworlders might be something more than naive rescuers with soft hearts and heavy hands. None of them understood that they were about to wake something ancient and terrible that humanity had kept locked away since they first learned to make tools from stone and bone. Kelvoth gave the order to begin preparing the false distress signal, and he felt certain that he had just saved his empire from collapse. He could not have been more mistaken. In a small office on the human colony of New Helsinki, a young communications officer named James Park was working the night shift and monitoring the standard frequencies for any signs of trouble. He had no idea that within a few hours he would receive a signal that would eventually lead to the largest war the galaxy had ever witnessed. He sipped his coffee and watched his screens and waited for something to happen. The trap was set and the bait was perfect. And Velfrani believed they understood exactly what would happen next. They were wrong about everything. The distress signal arrived at 1700 hours Galactic Standard Time, and it screamed across every emergency frequency with desperate urgency. James Park nearly dropped his coffee when his console lit up with flashing red warnings and that the automated translation began scrolling across his screen. Transport vessel Gentle Dawn requesting immediate assistance. The message read, "Life support failing, and we have 1,400 children aboard, and please help. Use please, we are dying." James felt his heart seize in his chest, and his hands trembled as he reached for the communication controls. He had trained for this moment, but training could never prepare anyone for the reality of hearing children crying in the background of a distress call. He forwarded the signal immediately to Fleet Command, and within minutes the response came back with orders that made his blood run cold. The coordinates placed the disabled transport in contested space near Wrath territory, and any rescue mission would be politically complicated and potentially dangerous. But there were children dying. James watched as the nearest vessel acknowledged the call, and he prayed that they would make it in time. Captain Elena Vasquez of the UN's Perseverance had been asleep in her quarters when the alert sounded, and she was on the bridge in under 3 minutes, with her uniform still being fastened as she took her command chair. "Report," she demanded, and her voice was sharp with the focus that came from 20 years of military service. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun pulled up the distress signal and let it play through the bridge speakers. The crying children in the background made several crew members look away, and Vasquez felt her jaw tighten with determination. 1,400 kids, Chun said quietly, and their life support is failing fast. How far? Vasquez asked. 6 hours at maximum burn, Chun replied. But Captain, the coordinates put them inside the disputed zone, and we would be entering space that the Wrath consider their territory. Vasquez did not hesitate for even a second. Set course and push the engines past safety limits, because we can repair engines later, but we cannot bring dead children back to life. The Perseverance lurched as the engines roared to full power and then beyond into dangerous territory that no engineer would recommend. Vasquez opened a channel to Fleet Command and reported her intentions clearly. This is Captain Vasquez, and I am responding to distress call at coordinate 7 Mark III, and I am aware of the political implications, and I am proceeding anyway. Admiral Harrison's voice came back with a sigh that suggested he had expected nothing less. Understood, Captain, and try not to start a war, but save those children. And Godspeed. The Perseverance streaked through space at speeds that made the hull groan, and the crew could feel the vibrations of overstressed engines beneath their feet. Vasquez stood at the center of her bridge and watched the countdown timer. That showed how long until they reached the distress coordinates. All hands, she announced over the ship-wide channel. We are responding to a civilian distress call involving children, and I expect every person on this ship to give everything they have, because failure is not an option. The crew responded with the efficiency that came from years of training and genuine dedication. Medical teams prepared for mass casualties, and engineers ran calculations to squeeze every bit of speed from the straining engine. 6 hours passed like 6 years for everyone aboard the Perseverance when they finally dropped out of faster-than-light travel. The crew was ready for a rescue operation. What they found instead was a Wrath battlegroup commander. Torvash of the Wrath Dominion had been patrolling this sector for 3 months, and he was bored and irritable and suspicious of everything that moved when his sensors detected a human warship entering his space at combat speeds. His first instinct was to assume the worst. Battle stations, he ordered, and his deep voice echoed through the bridge of his flagship, the Wrath of Ancestors. His tactical officer looked up with confusion in her golden eyes. Commander, should we not attempt communication first? Torvash snarled and showed his impressive teeth in a display of dominance that silenced any further questions. They come without warning and without diplomatic contact, and they come at speeds that suggest hostile intent, and I will not wait for them to fire first. The Wrath ships moved into attack formation with practiced precision on the Perseverance. Captain Vasquez stared at her tactical display with growing horror. Where is the transport? She demanded. I see Wrath warships, but where are the children? Lieutenant Chun worked frantically at her console, and her face grew pale as she checked and rechecked her readings. Captain, there is no transport, and there is no disabled vessel anywhere in this sector, and the distress signal is just gone. Vasquez felt ice form in her stomach. His understanding began to dawn. We were set up. She whispered. The Wrath opened fire before she could finish her thought. The first volley struck the Perseverance along her port side, and the ship shuddered with the impact of weapons designed to crack open armored hulls. Shields holding, the tactical officer shouted. But they are coming around for another pass. Vasquez had to make a decision in that moment, and it was a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She could retreat and let the Wrath think they had driven off an invasion, or she could fight back and risk making everything worse. A second volley struck the ship, and this time alarms began screaming as hull breaches opened on 3 decks. Return fire, Vasquez ordered, because she would not let her crew die without defending themselves. Target their weapon systems only and try to disable, not destroy. The Perseverance was not a battleship, but she was built by humans, and humans built there ships to survive conditions that would destroy any other vessel in the galaxy. She took hit after hit and kept fighting. Battle lasted 18 hours. Vasquez broadcast surrender offers and ceasefire requests on every frequency. but the Wrath either could not hear or would not listen. Her crew fought with desperate courage, and they managed to disable 3 Wrath cruisers without destroying them completely, but the cost was terrible. 42 crew members died in those 18 hours and many more were wounded. When the Perseverance finally limped away from the battle zone, she was barely holding together. Vasquez sat in her command chair surrounded by damage reports and casualty lists, and she felt something inside her change forever. She had come to save children. She had found only lies and death. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a cold voice whispered that someone had done this deliberately. Someone had used the promise of dying children to lure her into a trap. Vasquez did not know yet who was responsible, but she made a silent promise to herself. When she found out, she would make them pay. The Volthrani watched the battle from the safety of their hidden monitoring stations, and they celebrated their success with expensive wine and self-congratulation. Strategist Kelvoth received the reports with deep satisfaction. The first blood has been spilled, he announced to his advisors, and now we simply wait for the hatred to grow. He raised his glass in a toast to his own genius. He had no idea that he had just made the worst mistake in the history of his species. The Perseverance returned to human space as a wounded hero, and the news of the battle spread across every colony within days. Humanity was confused and angry and afraid because they did not understand why the Wrath had attacked without warning. Admiral Yuki Tanaka stood before the United Nations Space Command, and she listened to the debates and arguments with growing frustration. "We must retaliate," shouted Commander Williams from his seat at the long table. 42 of our people are dead, and we cannot let that stand without response. But we do not know why this happened, countered Ambassador Singh with his hands raised in a calming gesture. Perhaps it was a misunderstanding, and perhaps we can still find a peaceful solution. Admiral Tanaka said nothing because she was watching the intelligence reports that scrolled across her personal tablet. Her son Michael had been one of the 42 dead aboard the Perseverance. He had been 23 years old, and he had joined the fleet because he wanted to help people and protect those who could not protect themselves. Now he was gone, and Tanaka felt a grief so deep that it threatened to swallow her whole. But she was an admiral, and admirals did not have the luxury of falling apart. She forced her emotions into a locked room inside her mind, and she focused on the data in front of her. Something about this situation did not make sense. "We need more information," she announced, and her voice cut through the arguing voices like a blade through cloth. "Before we make any decisions about retaliation, we need to understand exactly what happened." The room fell silent because everyone knew that Admiral Tanaka had lost her son, and everyone respected her courage in continuing to lead despite her grief. Commander Okonkwo Tanaka continued, "I want you to lead a full intelligence investigation, and I want answers within the month." Commander David Okonkwo was the best intelligence officer in the fleet, and he nodded with determination in his dark eyes. "Yes, Admiral. And I will find the truth." Over the following weeks, Okonkwo and his team worked around the clock to analyze every piece of data from the incident. They examined the distress signal from every angle, and they interviewed survivors, and they studied Wrath communication patterns, and slowly a disturbing picture began to emerge. "Look at this," Okonkwo said to his assistant Lieutenant Park, who was the same young man who had first received the fatal distress call. He pointed to a frequency analysis on his screen. The signal was too clean and too perfect, and real distress calls have interference, and static and desperation makes people speak in fragments. Park leaned closer and studied the data with growing unease. "You think it was fabricated? I think it was manufactured by someone who wanted us to respond," Okonkwo confirmed. "And I think the coordinates were chosen specifically to place us in Wrath Patrol territory." The investigation continued and the evidence mounted. Then, a second distress call came. This time, it was supposedly a medical transport carrying wounded refugees, and this time, the UNS Horizon responded. They found another ambush waiting for them. 23 more humans died before the horizon could escape. Okonkwo worked through the night after receiving the news, and his eyes burned with exhaustion, but he refused to stop. A third call came, and a fourth and a fifth. Each one was perfectly crafted to appeal to human compassion. Each one led to bloodshed. By the end of the month, 217 humans had died in these ambushes, and tensions between humanity and the Wrath had reached a breaking point. But Okonkwo had finally found what he was looking for. "Admiral," he said when he entered Tanaka's office with a folder clutched in his hands. "I know who did this." Tanaka looked up from her desk, and her eyes were hollow from sleepless nights and grief that never quite went away. "Tell me," she said quietly. Aqua placed the folder on her desk and opened it to reveal technical analysis and intercepted communications and financial records that traced back to one source, the Volfrani Collective. He announced they created every single distress call, and they designed them specifically to lure our ships into Wrath space. Tanaka stared at the evidence, and she felt something cold settle into her chest. "Why?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Because they wanted us to fight the Wrath," Okonkwo explained. "They wanted to weaken both of our species so they could sweep in and claim dominance over the entire region." He paused and his voice grew harder. "They used children as bait, Admiral, and they did it 5 times because they thought our compassion made us predictable and exploitable." Tanaka closed her eyes, and she thought about her son who had died trying to save children who never existed. She thought about 217 other families who were grieving just as she was. She thought about the Velthrani sitting in their comfortable chambers and laughing at how easy it was to manipulate the stupid, compassionate humans. And then she opened her eyes and made a decision that would change the galaxy forever. "Call an emergency session of Space Command," she ordered, "and contact the Wrath government through back channels, because I want them to know the truth before we do anything else." Okonkwo nodded and turned to leave. "Commander," Tanaka called after him, and her voice had taken on a quality that made him stop and look back with something like fear. "Yes, Admiral. Prepare a full intelligence briefing for the public as well, because I want every human in every colony to know exactly what the Volfrani did to us." Okonkwo saluted and left. To carry out his orders, Tanaka sat alone in her office as she looked at a photograph on her desk that showed Michael smiling in his brand new uniform on the day he graduated from the academy. "I am sorry, my son," she whispered to the image. "I could not protect you, but I promise that your death will not be meaningless." She began writing the speech that she would deliver to humanity. It would not be a speech of anger or hatred. It would be something far more dangerous. It would be calm and cold and absolutely certain. And when humanity heard it, they would understand that the time for naive optimism was over. The Velthrani had made their choice. Now humanity would make theirs. Admiral Yuki Tanaka stood before the cameras in the United Nations Space Command Broadcast Center, and billions of humans across 100 worlds watched in silence. She wore her formal uniform with every medal and ribbon earned across 30 years of service, and her silver hair was pulled back severely from her face. Her expression showed no anger and no tears and no weakness of any kind. She looked like a statue carved from ice. "Citizens of humanity," she began, and her voice was steady and controlled. "I speak to you today to share information that will be difficult to hear, but you deserve the truth." She paused and let the silence stretch across the stars. "Over the past 4 months, we have lost 217 of our people in what appeared to be rescue operations gone wrong, and we believed that we were in conflict with the Wrath Dominion because of misunderstandings and territorial disputes." Her eyes found the camera and seemed to look directly into the soul of every person watching. "We were wrong, and we were deceived, and the truth is far more terrible than simple war." She pressed a control, and a holographic display appeared beside her showing the evidence that Commander Okonkwo had gathered. The Velthrani Collective fabricated every distress signal that led our ships into danger, and they created fake emergencies involving children and families and refugees because they knew that we would respond. Ripple of shock spread across human space as the implications became clear. They counted on our compassion, and they used our best qualities as weapons against US, and they laughed as our people died trying to save lives that were never in danger. Tanaka let the anger flow through humanity before she continued. The Wrath Dominion has been contacted, and they have been shown the evidence. And they are as outraged as we are, because they too were manipulated into killing and dying for Velthrani benefit. This revelation caused even more shock, because humans had been preparing for war with the Wrath, and now they learned that the Wrath were fellow victims. I will not tell you what to feel, Tanaka said, because every human has the right to their own response to this betrayal. She straightened her shoulders, and her voice took on a harder edge. But I will tell you what the United Nations Space Command intends to do. Every human leaned closer to their screens. We came to the stars, hoping to find friends and partners in the great adventure of exploring the universe, and we answered every call for help, because that is who we are and who we have always been. Her hands tightened at her sides. The Velthrani saw our compassion and called it weakness, and they saw our trust and called it stupidity, and they used the screams of dying children as bait to lure us into traps. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was cold. Enough to freeze stars. They will learn the difference between mercy and weakness, and they will learn it exactly once. The broadcast continued as BOS. Tanaka outlined the formal declaration of war against the Velthrani Collective. It was not a declaration made in anger or hatred, but in cold, determined justice. Humanity would not seek revenge. Humanity would seek accountability. Every architect of the false distress scheme would face trial. Every resource stolen through manipulation would be returned. Every Velthrani institution that had participated in the plot would be dismantled. If the Velthrani resisted, then humanity would demonstrate exactly what a Deathworld species could do when they stopped being friendly. The galaxy watched the broadcast with fascination and fear. The Wrath commander Torvash, who had led the attack on the Perseverance, sent a personal message to Captain Vasquez apologizing for the deaths he had caused. Vasquez accepted the apology and asked if the Wrath would be willing to fight alongside humanity against their common enemy. Torvash said yes without hesitation. The Mokai, who had been fighting the Velthrani for years, sent offers of alliance and support. The Fenari, who had lived under Velthrani economic control for generations, began quiet rebellions on a dozen worlds. Even species that had never met humans watched the broadcast and understood that something fundamental had changed in galactic politics. High strategist Calvoth watched the broadcast from his command chamber, and for the first time in his long life, he felt genuine terror. This was not supposed to happen. He whispered to Melith, who stood beside him with fear written across her features. They were supposed to fight the Wrath, not unite with them. Melith checked her tablet with trembling hands. The Wrath fleet is already moving toward human space, and they are not attacking, and they appear to be joining the human formation. Calvoth grabbed the tablet and stared at the tactical display. Human ships and Wrath ships flying together toward Velthrani territory. The impossible had become reality. Mobilize every ship we have, he ordered, and sent messages to every species in the galaxy asking for aid against the human aggression. But the messages went unanswered. No one wanted to help the Velthrani because no one trusted them anymore. Commander Okonkwo had done his work well, and the evidence of Velthrani manipulation had spread to every corner of known space species that had suffered under Velthrani influence for centuries. Saw an opportunity to finally be free. Species that had remained neutral saw the wisdom of staying out of the coming conflict. The Velthrani stood alone, and humanity was coming. Admiral Tanaka stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Un's Resolve, as she watched the fleet assemble around her. 300 human warships, 150 wrath vessels, supply ships and medical transports, and troop carriers from a dozen allied species. It was the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history. Admiral, a communications officer reported, "The fleet is ready and awaiting your orders." Tanaka looked at the star map that showed Velthrani space laid out before her like a puzzle waiting to be solved. "All ships," she announced, "set course for the Velthrani border and maintain formation, and we advance at dawn." She paused and added one final thought. "And remember who we are fighting for, and remember the 217 who died believing they were saving children, and let their memory guide us to victory with honor." The fleet moved as one. The war had begun. The first Velthrani system to fall was Korvath Prime, and it fell in 6 hours. Velthrani commanders had prepared defensive positions that should have held for weeks, and they had placed their best ships in strategic locations, and they had fortified every approach. None of it mattered. The human fleet arrived at the edge of the system and immediately did something that no sane species would attempt. They accelerated directly toward the Velthrani defense line at speeds that should have made accurate targeting impossible. "They are insane," shouted the Velthrani fleet commander as he watched the human ship streak toward his carefully positioned forces. No one can fight at those velocities, but humans were not like other species. Humans had evolved on a world where survival meant reacting faster than predators, and where hesitation meant death. Their nervous systems processed information more quickly than any other known sentient species, and their reflexes had been honed by millions of years of running from things that wanted to eat them. What seemed like suicide to Velthrani officers was simply Tuesday for human pilots. The human ships wove through the Velthrani formation like water through rocks, and they fired as they passed, and they never stopped moving. Velthrani gunners tried to track them and failed. Velthrani computers tried to predict their movements and failed. Within hours, the defensive line was shattered, and the human fleet was establishing orbital control over Korvath Prime. On the ground, things were even more terrifying for the Velthrani defenders. Human soldiers dropped from orbit in armored pods that slammed into the surface with bone-rattling force. Any other species would have been injured or killed by such a landing. Humans climbed out of the craters and started fighting immediately. Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez led his squad through the streets of the Velthrani capital, and he barely noticed the higher gravity that made every step feel like walking through mud. Earth's gravity was even worse, and he had trained in environments that would have crushed Velthrani soldiers into paste. Contact left. One of his soldiers called out, and the squad reacted as a single organism. They moved with speed and precision that made the Velthrani defenders feel like they were moving in slow motion. The battle for the capital lasted 2 days. The Velthrani had more soldiers and better defensive positions, but they could not match human endurance. Humans did not sleep for 3 days, and they did not stop fighting, and they did not give up even when wounded. A Velthrani officer watched in horror as a human soldier continued advancing with 3 separate wounds that should have been incapacitating. "What are you?" the officer screamed as the human closed the distance between them. "We are from Earth," the soldier replied, "and you should not have used our children as bait." Word spread through the Velthrani military faster than official communications could travel. The Deathworlders were everything the old stories had warned about and more. They fought in conditions that killed other species. They shrugged off injuries that would have hospitalized entire Velthrani battalions. They kept coming no matter what was thrown at them, and worst of all, they were not driven by rage or hatred, but by something far more terrifying. They were driven by cold, determined purpose. Admiral Tanaka directed the campaign from her flagship, and she refused to allow unnecessary destruction. "We are here for justice," she reminded her commanders, Not revenge, and I want minimal civilian casualties, and I want infrastructure preserved wherever possible. Some officers questioned this approach and argued that the Velthrani deserved total devastation. Tanaka shut them down immediately. "We are better than they are," she said, "and we will prove it by how we fight and how we treat those who surrender." The Reth were learning new respect for their human allies with every passing day. Commander Torvash watched the human soldiers in action, and he felt both admiration and relief that his people were not fighting against them. "They do not stop," he said to his second officer with wonder in his voice. "I have seen them fight for 30 hours without rest, and they simply refuse to acknowledge exhaustion." His officer nodded with equal amazement. "And yet they show mercy to prisoners, and they protect civilians, and they are terrifying and honorable at the same time." System after system fell to the Allied advance. The Velthrani tried everything they could think of to slow the human assault. They fortified planets, and humans found ways around the defenses. They laid traps and ambushes, and humans detected them with sensors designed for hunting prey on a predator-filled world. They tried to negotiate individual surrenders, and humans accepted them with fairness, and then continued. Advancing High Strategist Kelvoth received daily reports that grew more desperate with each passing week. Korvath Prime has fallen, Malith reported on the first day. The 7th Fleet has been destroyed. She reported a week later. The outer colonies are requesting permission to surrender. She said the following month Kelvoth felt his empire crumbling around him, and he could not understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. He had studied humans before launching his scheme, and he had concluded that they were soft-hearted fools who could be manipulated through their emotions. He had been half right. Humans were compassionate and caring, and they genuinely wanted to help others. But he had missed the other half of the equation. Humans were also apex predators from a death world, and when their compassion was used against them, they responded with the fury of a species that had clawed its way to the top of the food chain. Through millions of years of violent evolution, they did not become cruel or savage. They became efficient, and that was far more terrifying than any amount of rage could have been. 4 months after the war began, 17 Velthrani systems had fallen to the Allied advance, and the human fleet was approaching the core worlds of the collective. Velva stood in his command chamber and stared at the tactical display that showed enemy ships closing on everything he had spent his life building. How did this happen? He asked the empty room. No answer came, because there was no answer that could make sense of the disaster he had brought upon his people. He had poked a sleeping predator, and now he was watching it wake up and stretch its claws, and it was coming for him. High Strategist Kelvoth had not slept in 6 days, and his 4 eyes were bloodshot, and his hands trembled as he reviewed the latest casualty reports. The war was lost, and everyone knew it, but no one dared say the words out loud. 23 systems had fallen, and the human fleet was now less than 2 weeks from Velthroth Prime itself. "We need to negotiate," Malith urged him for the 100th time. "We need to surrender before they reach the homeworld." Kelvoth spun to face her with fury burning in his exhausted eyes. "Surrender means trials and tribunals, and it means I will be held responsible for everything. You are responsible for everything." Malith replied quietly, and there was something new in her voice that sounded almost like contempt. Kelvoth stared at her, and for a moment he saw himself through her eyes. He saw an old man who had gambled with the lives of millions and lost everything. Saw the architect of the greatest disaster in Velthrani history. He saw a fool who had mistaken compassion for weakness. "Leave me," he ordered, and his voice cracked with exhaustion, and Shamaleth bowed and departed without another word. Alone in his chamber, Kelvoth began to formulate one final desperate plan. If he could not win the war, then perhaps he could change the terms of the defeat. He called an emergency meeting of the remaining military commanders, and he presented his idea with the desperate energy of a drowning man reaching for any floating debris. "We will threaten to destroy ourselves," he announced. The commanders stared at him with expressions ranging from confusion to horror. If the humans attack Velthros Prime, we will detonate fusion bombs in our own cities, and we will kill millions of our own people, and we will tell the galaxy that the humans forced us to do it. General Vorthik rose from his seat with disgust written across his features. You would murder our own civilians to avoid accountability for your crimes. I would do whatever is necessary to preserve our species, Kelvoth replied. And the humans are soft-hearted fools who will not want the blood of innocents on their hands. He pointed to the tactical display that showed the approaching human fleet. They have shown mercy throughout this war, and they have protected civilians and minimized destruction, and that is their weakness. General Vorthik shook his head slowly. That is not weakness, and that is strength, and you still do not understand what you are dealing with. I understand that they will hesitate. If we threaten mass suicide, Kelvoth insisted, and that hesitation will give us leverage to negotiate better terms. The debate continued for hours, but in the end, Kelvoth had enough loyal commanders to implement his plan. The Velthrani defense fleet formed a protective sphere around their homeworld, and they broadcast their terrible ultimatum to the approaching human forces. If you attack Velthros Prime, we will detonate nuclear weapons in our own population centers, and the deaths of millions will be your responsibility. Admiral Tanaka received the message on the bridge of the Resolve, and she listened to it 3 times before responding her. Officers watched her with concern, because this was exactly the kind of moral dilemma that could paralyze a commander. Tanaka thought about her son Michael, who had died trying to save children who never existed. She thought about the 217 who had followed him into death. She thought about the millions of Velthrani civilians who would suffer if she made the wrong choice. And then she thought about what kind of message it would send to the galaxy if humanity allowed mass murderers to escape justice by threatening to kill their own people. Open a channel. She ordered. Her communications officer complied, and suddenly, Tanaka's voice was broadcasting across Velthrani space. This is Admiral Yuki Tanaka of the United Nations Space Command. She began, and I am responding to your ultimatum. She paused and chose her next words carefully. You used the deaths of children to bait us into traps, and you wagered everything on the belief that our compassion was weakness. Her voice remained calm and steady. Now you hide behind your own people and expect just to flinch. She looked directly into the camera. We do not want your extinction, and we do not want your suffering, and we want you to understand permanently that there are lines that cannot be crossed. She transmitted a document that contained her terms: unconditional surrender with war crimes, tribunals for those responsible for the false distress scheme, and reparations to the Narrations to the Figerns. Hider responsible for the false distress scheme and reparations to the families of the dead, and restructuring of your government under galactic oversight. Her terms were harsh, but they were not cruel. In exchange, we will not bombard your world, and we will not invade, and we will not seek revenge against your civilian population. She concluded with words that would echo through history. You have 72 hours to accept these terms, and if you refuse, then we will wait. Wait. Kelvoth repeated when he heard the message. What does that mean? The answer became clear over the following days. The human fleet did not attack. They simply held position and waited, and on Velthros Prime, the civilian population began to learn the truth about what their government had done. Commander Okonkwo had prepared for this moment, and his intelligence teams had been broadcasting the evidence of Velthrani crimes directly to civilian communications networks. The people learned about the fake distress signals. They learned about the dead children that never existed. They learned about the plan to murder their own citizens to avoid justice, and they learned that the humans were offering mercy despite everything that had been done to them. The revolution began on the 3rd day. Kelvoth watched from his command chamber as crowds gathered in the streets of the capital. He watched as military units began refusing orders. He watched as his carefully constructed power structure collapsed. Around him, Elith entered his chamber one final time, and she was not alone behind. Her stood a group of Velthrani soldiers who wore the uniforms of his own personal guard, but whose eyes held no loyalty. The people have made their choice, Melith announced, and they choose to accept the human terms. Kelvoth tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. Guards seized him and bound his hands and began marching him toward the spaceport, where a shuttle waited to carry him to Admiral Tanaka's flagship. As he was led through the streets, he saw the faces of his own people watching him pass. There was no sympathy in their eyes. There was no anger either. There was only exhaustion and relief that the nightmare was finally ending. Kelvoth had spent his entire life believing that compassion was weakness. Now he was learning the truth. Compassion was strength, and those who used it against others would always eventually face the consequences. High strategist Kelvoth stood in chains on the bridge of the Un's Resolve, and he looked smaller than anyone had expected. Admiral Tanaka studied him from her command chair, and she searched for some sign of the monster who had caused so much death. All she saw was a frightened old man who had made terrible choices and was finally facing the consequences. "Do you understand why you are here?" she asked him. Kelvoth's 4 eyes darted around the bridge, taking in the human officers who watched him with expressions ranging from disgust to pity. "I am here because I lost," he replied. "You are here because you murdered 217 people using their own compassion as a weapon." Tanaka corrected him. "You are here because you tried to start a war between species for your own benefit." She rose from her chair and approached him slowly. "You are here because you believed that kindness was weakness and that those who helped others could be exploited without consequence." Kelvoth met her eyes, and for a moment, something like defiance flickered in his gaze. "I was trying to save my people," he said. "The Reth were threatening our borders, and the Mokai were in revolt, and we were surrounded by enemies. So you created more enemies." Tanaka replied, "You took a species that wanted to be your friend, and you turned them into your executioners." She shook her head with something that might have been sadness. "We would have helped you if you had asked, and we would have mediated your disputes with the Reth, and we would have found solutions to your problems. You would have eventually dominated us." Kelvoth insisted. "Your species breeds like parasites and expands like a plague, and we would have been absorbed into your civilization within a generation." Tanaka considered this, and to his surprise she nodded. "Perhaps and perhaps not, but you never gave us the chance to prove you wrong, and instead you chose the path that led to this moment." She gestured, and guards stepped forward to take custody of the prisoner. "You will be transported to the Galactic Court at Nexus Station, where you will face trial for crimes against sentient life, and you will receive a fair hearing, and you will have the opportunity to present your defense." Kelvoth laughed bitterly. "A fair trial from the species I tried to destroy, and I'm certain that will be genuine justice." "It will be," Tanaka replied, "because that is who we are, and no matter what you did to us, we will not become like you." The guards escorted Kelvoth from the bridge, and Tanaka turned to address her officers. "Begin coordinating with the Provisional Velthrani government to establish humanitarian aid distribution, and I want medical teams on the surface within 6 hours." Commander Chun looked up from her console with surprise. "Admiral, the war just ended, and should we not focus on securing our victory first?" "The war ended when their people chose to reject their government's crimes," Tanaka replied. "And now we have an opportunity to show the galaxy what humanity truly stands for." She looked around the bridge at the tired faces of men and women who had fought for months and lost friends and family in a war they had never wanted. "We did not come here for conquest, and we did not come here for revenge, and we came here for justice, and justice includes helping those who were caught in the middle through no fault of their own." The humanitarian mission began within hours. Human Medical teams deployed to Velthrani worlds that had been devastated by the war, and they treated wounded civilians without asking which side they had. Supported human engineers helped repair infrastructure that had been damaged in the fighting human. Diplomats worked with the provisional government to establish fair elections and transparent institutions. The galaxy watched with amazement as the Deathworlders showed a different kind of strength. I do not understand them. Commander Torvash admitted to Captain Vasquez during a joint patrol mission. They could crush the Velthrani completely, and instead they helped rebuild. Vasquez smiled, and there was a warmth in her expression that had been missing since the first battle. That is what makes us human, she explained. We fight when we must, but we would rather build than destroy. Torvash considered this for a long moment. My people have always believed that strength comes from domination, and that the strong rule the weak through fear. And now? Vasquez asked. Now I am beginning to think we were wrong. Torvash replied, because the humans have demonstrated a strength that does not require domination. The trial of High Strategist Kelvoth lasted 3 months, and it was broadcast across the galaxy. Every species watched as the evidence was presented and witnesses testified. And the full scope of the conspiracy was revealed at Kelvoth's defense team argued that he had acted to protect his people from existential threats and that his methods, while extreme, had been motivated by genuine fear. The prosecution presented the families of the 217 dead and let them speak about the children and parents and siblings they had lost. In the end, the verdict was unanimous guilty. On all counts, Kelvoth was sentenced to life imprisonment on a secure facility where he would never harm anyone again. Was not executed because humanity had long ago abandoned capital punishment. Some species saw this as weakness, but others understood it for what it was. It was a statement that even the worst criminals were not worth abandoning principles over. Admiral Tanaka attended the sentencing, and when it was over, she walked out of the courtroom into the bright light of Nexus Station's artificial sun. Captain Vasquez was waiting for her. How do you feel? Vasquez asked. Tanaka considered the question carefully. I feel like we did something important today, she replied. Not just punishing the guilty, but showing the galaxy that there is another way. She looked up at the stars visible through the station's transparent dome. Michael would have been proud. Vasquez put a hand on her admiral's shoulder. Yes, he would have been. They stood together in silence, and for the first time since the war began, Tanaka allowed herself to grieve properly. The justice was done. Now the healing could begin. 20 years had passed since the end of the Velthrani War, and the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood on the observation deck of Nexus Station and watched ships from 100 different species pass through the great crossroads of galactic civilization. Her hair had gone gray, and her face showed the lines of age and experience, but her eyes were still sharp, and her mind was still quick. Ambassador, her assistant called from behind her. The Velthrani delegation has arrived for the anniversary ceremony. Vasquez turned and smiled. Thank you, Marcus, and tell them I will be there shortly. She took one last look at the stars before heading to the diplomatic reception hall. The ceremony was held every year to commemorate the end of the war and to honor those who had died on all sides. It had started as a human tradition, but over time it had grown to include representatives from every species that had been affected by the conflict. The Wrath sent their largest delegation because they considered themselves blood brothers to humanity after fighting alongside them. The Fanari sent dancers and musicians because their culture expressed grief and hope through art. The Molkai sent warriors who stood in solemn silence because their traditions demanded quiet respect for the fallen. And the Velthrani sent their new leaders, who came to acknowledge the crimes of the past and to demonstrate their commitment to a different future. Vasquez took her place on the stage beside Commander Torvash, who had been her friend for 2 decades. Another year, he rumbled in his deep voice. Another year. She agreed. The ceremony began with the reading of names. 2 117 human names, followed by the thousands of Reth and Vilthrani who had died in the fighting that followed. Each name was spoken clearly, and each was accompanied by a moment of silence. When the names were finished, the new Vilthrani chancellor, Malith, took the stage. She was old now, and her movements were slow, but her voice was strong. "I was there when the scheme was planned," she said to the assembled crowd, "and I was there when it failed, and I have spent every day since trying to atone for my silence." She looked out at the faces watching her. "We cannot undo the past, but we can choose our future and the Vilthrani. People have chosen to be partners in building something better." She turned to face Vasquez directly. "On behalf of my people, I renew our pledge to honor the memory of those who died, and to never again use compassion as a weapon." Vasquez stepped forward and clasped hands with the Chancellor in the gesture of friendship that had become traditional at these ceremonies. The crowd applauded, and for a moment, the old wounds felt a little less raw. After the ceremony, Vasquez walked through the halls of Nexus Station, and she found herself at the memorial wall. The wall contained the names of everyone who had died in the conflict, and it stretched for hundreds of meters in both directions. Near the center was a small section dedicated to the crew of the UN's Perseverance. Vasquez reached out and touched the name of Michael Tanaka. Admiral Yuki Tanaka had died 5 years ago, and she had been buried with full military honors on Earth. But Vasquez still felt her presence whenever she stood at this wall. She would be proud of what we built. A voice said from behind her. Vasquez turned to find Commander David Okonkwo standing a few meters away. He had retired from active service years ago, but he still attended every anniversary ceremony. Yes, she would. Vasquez agreed. They stood together in comfortable silence for a while. "I received an interesting report this morning," Okonkwo said eventually. "There was a distress call from a transport near the outer rim." Vasquez felt her heart skip a beat. "A real one this time," Okonkwo assured her, "and the responding ship was crewed by humans and Reth and Vilthrani working together." He smiled, and there was something warm and hopeful in his expression. "They saved 37 lives, and the transport captain said she had never seen different species work together so seamlessly." Vasquez felt tears prick at her eyes. "That is what we fought for," she said quietly. "Not victory or vengeance, but this." She gestured at the station around them, where thousands of beings from hundreds of worlds lived and worked and built something new together. "We fought so that the next generation would have a chance to be better than we were." Okonkwo nodded. "And they are taking that chance and running with it." He looked at the memorial wall one last time. "The galaxy remembers what happened here, and they remember that humanity answered every call for help, even when it cost us everything. And we still do." Vasquez added, "We still answer every call." "Of course we do," Okonkwo replied, "because that is who we are." They walked away from the memorial together, and behind them the names of the fallen gleamed in the soft light. The galaxy had learned an important lesson from the Vilthrani War. They learned that there was a species among the stars who would always come when called, and who would fight to protect those who could not protect themselves. They had learned that this species was dangerous beyond measure when threatened, but merciful in victory. They had learned that humanity's compassion was not weakness, but the greatest strength in the universe. And they had learned to never ever use children as bait, because the Deathworlders from Earth would cross any distance and fight any enemy and sacrifice anything to answer a cry for help. That was the legacy of the 217. That was the promise that humanity kept to the stars, and that was why, when distress signals went out across the galaxy, ships of every species now responded, because humanity had taught them that helping others was not weakness. It was the foundation of civilization itself. The memorial wall stood as a reminder of what had been lost, but the station around it stood as a monument to what had been gained, a galaxy united by compassion instead of fear, a future built on trust instead of manipulation, and a species of Deathworlders who had shown everyone that the strongest thing in the universe was a hand extended in friendship, even when that hand could have been a fist. The end.